Welcome to The Debate. Our discussion today focuses on, well, one of the most jarring and complex narratives revealed in the recent episodes of The Deep Dive, the complete 2025 collapse of Daniel L. Bates, the executive architect behind the V2V16 music ecosystem. We're talking about the staggering paradox of a man whose financial stability was robust, documented with a peak annual income of over $170,000, yet who was ultimately rendered totally homeless and operationally paralyzed by the simple inability to pay a single mandatory $630 debt.
That incredible chasm, the one between documented six-figure success and literal ruin over a minor bill, that is the critical space we have to analyze. It suggests a fundamental hidden fracture in his existence.
Absolutely. And that fracture really frames our central question for this debate. Was this catastrophic collapse primarily a failure of the external systems, the legal, the economic, and bureaucratic safety nets designed to protect citizens like him, or was it, as my colleague suggests, the inevitable result of his inherent, unsustainable internal psychological architecture? I'm going to argue that systemic failure was the decisive and primary cause.
And I see why you'd think that, but I come at it from a different way. While we cannot deny the brutal external triggers, I contend that the foundation was already structurally unstable. It was due to self-imposed psychological depletion. The constant, profound internal contradiction made the collapse, in my view, preordained. The system's failure merely found the weakest link and provided the final fatal blow. The real vulnerability was already internal.
Okay, so let's establish what Bates lost. We are not talking about some transient lifestyle. The foundational structure of his executive life, what he called the ghost persona, was incredibly stable. 11 consecutive years of residency at Preston Valley and over a decade of high-level, reliable W-2 employment. Roles like warehouse supervisor, luxury suite attendant. This stability proves the ghost was structurally sound and, playing by the rules. The real failure began when that structural environment became hostile. The primary shock was the job loss, November 2024. But the ruin was rapidly and brutally accelerated by the very systems meant to mitigate that shock. Specifically, the Texas Workforce Commission, the TWC, the unemployment agency. It failed to deploy a single dollar in benefits during the critical cash-consuming months of January and February 2025. This consumed his emergency reserves precisely when he needed them most.
I agree that the WWC failure was unforgivable, but I would frame it differently. Systemic friction happens. It's a part of life. Truly resilient architecture absorbs friction. So the question is, what prevented him from absorbing it? Look at the objective empirical data from the psychological assessments. We have the Journey-Front assessment results clearly showing DLB scoring profoundly low in two critical areas required for his life: social interests and enterprising interests. His life demanded constant, high-energy commitment to two roles that fundamentally contradicted his psychological design. First, being a full-time empire builder, the founder of V2V16, which contradicts his low enterprising score. A low desire for profit, domination, or market control. And second, being a dedicated long-term caregiver for Bruce Nutter, a massive and relentless emotional and logistical drain, which is directly at odds with his low social interest score. This forced operation in roles that inherently drained his core psychological reserves, rather than fulfilling them, created a state of perpetual exhaustion we call duty over design. He was operating on fumes long before the TWC failed him. That $630 tripwire, it was just the final ignition spark.
That's a compelling point about the internal conflict, but you're focusing on the internal fuel gauge, when the external system was actively drilling holes in his gas tank. We need to examine the financial logistics that guaranteed failure before the job loss even registered. Look at the history of the repeated impounding of his vehicle, the Nissan Nismo, by the apartment complex. In late 2023 and early 2024, records show he was forced to divert hundreds of dollars, money that should have gone toward rent and stability, directly toward recovery fees, just to get his mobility back. This was punitive friction, leveraging minor non-compliance to strip him of a critical asset, his car. This cascade of debt, compounded by the TWC's $0 payments, bled him dry logistically. The system created a financial vortex, and the final fatal action, the alleged willful violation of the federal automatic stay in September 2025 by the creditor.
This led to an illegal eviction and total loss of nearly $27,000 in property before that $630 payment was even technically due. The system wasn't just flawed, it was actively predatory and failed to enforce its own laws.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning because while the system's actions were undeniably punitive, the underlying volatility is what made the impact catastrophic. If the financial architecture had been truly resilient, those impoundment fees would have been an inconvenience, not a destabilizing force. But the $170,000 income wasn't a secure foundation. It was a thin shield built over what I would call a financial volcano. We have documentation, for example, of the staggering decision to spend over $37,000 on just 2 NBA Finals tickets shortly after his income zenith. This wasn't a standard investment. It represents a profound psychological need for constant peak emotional triumph. It's an unsustainable pattern. You earn a massive amount, but immediately spend a significant fraction on high-risk, high-reward, non-essential emotional validation. This behavior, combined with the extreme cognitive overhead required to maintain his 3 separate, compartmentalized identities, the compliant ghost, the protective armor, and the expressive escape, it meant that surface stability was impossible to sustain, even at maximum income. The ghost was already cracking under the sheer maintenance costs, as evidenced by that severe lapse in judgment during the 2024 cocktail mix negligence incident. The system's friction just exploited a flaw that was already structurally present in his risk profile.
I see the financial volatility, but you're defining a successful high achiever's discretionary spending as a structural flaw. I mean, many high earners engage in high-risk emotional spending. The key question is, did that spending cause the collapse, or did the cessation of cash flow followed by illegal predatory action cause the collapse? The external action was the proximal material cause.
But the volatility dictates the distance to the edge. If the external shocks are the wind, the volatility is the height of the chimney. He was built tall and thin. And let's transition that volatility into the cost of his coping mechanisms. Let's talk about the identity system itself. The highly complex fragmentation system of Daniel Bates' ghost, DLB armor, and Dante East's escape was certainly a necessary defense against the severity of his bipolar and PTSD diagnosis. But its maintenance required perpetual cognitive vigilance, that state of trauma-forged compliance where every single action is filtered through layers of self-protection to prevent exposure or breakdown. This overhead was the single greatest psychological resource drain. The complexity of the system became its own vulnerability because it was too dependent on the ghost's strained material function. And the proof is right there. The fact that the ghost's material failure, the eviction, immediately caused operational paralysis and the cancellation of the November album Born on the 6th Bipolar Scorpio proves the entire structure was too rigid and too reliant on the continued exhausting functionality of one persona. The internal architecture failed by ceasing creative and operational output at the very moment resilience was needed.
That's a powerful reading of the interdependence, though. I would frame it as a successful blueprint for resilience under pressure. You're describing the complexity of the identity system as a vulnerability, but its core goal was succession and autonomy, specifically to protect artists from industry exploitation. This is reflected in that radical freedom contract philosophy, which ensures nobody is bound here ever. That structure survived. Furthermore, the compartmentalization succeeded because the failure was material, not existential. The core code, the moral imperative, it endured. Even when facing total ruin, the armor persona, DLB, secured the critical recovery of the Nissan Mismo, reestablishing his mobility and preserving a major asset. More importantly, the assignment of Danieletta, which is the spiritual code of resistance and integrity, remained fully functional. He continued to document the archive, continued to resist the creditor, and refused to quit. The system endured the shock, even if the creative output of the escape persona was temporarily silenced. The failure originated externally, but the internal architecture proved its ultimate strength by protecting the founder's moral core.
Enduring is not thriving, and resilience has to be measured by the cost. You say the moral core survived, and that leads us directly to the most damning evidence of internal vulnerability, the Bruce Nutter paradox. You point to Daniel Bates's immediate priority, even while homeless and possessing only $65 cash on hand, as securing safe housing for his dependent, Bruce Nutter, and the service dog, Champ. This act of fierce mercy, prioritizing the vulnerable over self-preservation, is often lauded as unshakable moral commitment.
And it is. It demonstrates a moral fortitude that just overrides any psychological depletion score. He executed a logistical and emotional feat despite his profound emotional exhaustion. This is the ultimate proof that the internal engine is powerful enough to ignore its own low fuel warning when integrity demands action.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that this proves stability. That very commitment, while profoundly admirable, was the final critical act of duty over design that guaranteed absolute depletion. We return to the low social interest score. Sustained, complex, emotional, and logistical care for Bruce was inherently draining, consuming the last vestiges of his psychological reserves. The archive documents him spending his limited mental bandwidth arguing over $113 motel charges and navigating Red Cross housing logistics for another person, precisely when his own mind was collapsing into profound anxiety and depression. He himself documented this internal state in his 4 a.m. thoughts, feeling like a shadow trying too hard to wear his skin. This hyper-responsibility and inability to prioritize self-preservation ensured he zeroed out his psychological reserves. He wasn't surviving the shock. He was guaranteeing his burnout by accepting external mandates, the duty of care that directly contradicted his psychological design, making him structurally vulnerable.
But the material result of that duty was successful stabilization for Bruce. If the internal structure were fundamentally broken, that level of highly complex, high-stakes logistical maneuvering would have been impossible. The ability to execute this high-level external problem-solving proves that even under extreme duress, when the financial ghost was dead, the practical protective armor was able to function and secure the outcome for the dependent, which was a core mission of the V2V ecosystem. The failure was not in his ability to act or organize. The failure was in the external environment that forced him into that desperate $65 in hand position to begin with. The system created the crisis, and he used his internal framework to solve the crisis for everyone but himself, which is a structural success in his terms.
But the problem is that the system only consumed the ghost. The internal structure consumed the armor. The fact that he successfully placed Bruce means he exhausted the last functional part of his resource pool. He solved an external problem by creating an internal, existential one. The systemic failure merely provided the scenario where the only way to meet his moral commitment was to run his psychological engine past the red line, guaranteeing the subsequent collapse and operational paralysis. It wasn't the $630 debt. It was the psychological cost of maintaining that duty over design existence that led to the paralysis.
We maintain that the catastrophic material loss was not predetermined by internal psychological flaws. A decade of meticulously maintained conventional stability was wiped out entirely within a 90-day period due to the comprehensive failure of institutional safety nets, the TWWC, the failure to enforce the federal stay, and the punitive predatory actions of the apartment complex. His successful defense of his mobility and his ethical execution of the Bruce Nutter duty prove the internal architecture is functional, albeit strained. The external systems were designed to consume and exploit vulnerability.
And I must conclude that the collapse was fundamentally inevitable because the dual pressure of the compliant ghost persona and the profoundly energy-draining caretaker role fundamentally contradicted his inherent psychological needs. This dynamic created a chronic state of perpetual exhaustion that zeroed out his reserves, forcing him to be the one thing his profile was designed to resist: emotionally exposed and undefended. The $630 debt failure was simply the physical manifestation of that total internal depletion.
The case of Daniel Bates debated here based on the Neon Core Media's The Deep Dive. raises a profound and unsettling question for everyone following this documentation. If your self-worth and moral integrity are rooted in fulfilling mandates like caretaking and empire building that actively drain your core reserves, does that very moral commitment become the structural crack in your foundation that external forces will eventually exploit?
And perhaps the more immediate question, given that he survived the literal lion's den of homelessness and legal jeopardy, is whether that resilience is ultimately attributable to the strength of his internal armor, or is it merely evidence of the profound weakness and ineptitude of the system that tried, but ultimately failed to consume him completely? We leave you with those tensions to explore in the unfolding archive.